Well, it's now time for me to introduce our feature speaker for the evening, and I know who many of you have come along to hear tonight. Seth Berkley has worked in the front line of global health in many ways. As an epidemiologist in Uganda, he's also worked for the US Centre for Disease Control. He's founded and led the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, YAVI, which of course you'll heard of, which is an effort to fast-track a vaccine for the global emergency that is HIV/AIDS. Here in Australia, though, we don't like overachievers, so you'll be disappointed to hear that he's also a pilot, and if you were listening to the ABC radio this morning, you'll find out that he had a very interesting career as a CIA front undermining the Green movement in Australia. Perhaps he can explain a little more about that. But in 2011, most importantly, he joined Gavi. He's going to tell you more about their remarkable work and, most importantly for us here, Australia's contribution. Would you please welcome him, Seth Berkley.
I'm going to try to take you through a brief vista of what we do at IAVI, the power of vaccines, equity issues around vaccines, the long-term sustainability of what we're trying to do, and challenges and opportunities for the future. So we'll start off with the power of vaccines. And this is an interesting issue. This is 1798 until 1910. You can see there were only a few vaccines in here. And my father actually was born around here. He only had one vaccine as a child. We can move on to the next era. I was born in here, and I had a handful of vaccines. But I have two children. They were born out here, and they have been protected against more than a dozen antigens. This is really an extraordinary thing. This is the timeline shrunk, and what you see here is the number of vaccines that have been developed. And you'll see that we're in a renaissance, and more are coming. We've seen dramatic effects from these vaccines. So over these years, you've seen the population increase, 1980 to 2010, 30 years, a 54% increase in population. And you can see these terrible diseases of childhood, we've seen dramatic reductions from the effects of vaccines. In fact, one of the problems we'll come back to is in places like Australia, we don't see these diseases regularly, so people don't even remember how bad they are. But all you have to do is go to a refugee camp and see a measles outbreak, run through it, and count the number of bodies of small children who get killed by it. The greatest success, perhaps, is around disease eradication. Smallpox in 1979 cost about $100 million to do that campaign, and it's estimated that we're saving about $1.3 billion a year from this. And here is the sheet of paper, the parchment signed by the members of the Global Commission for Certification of Smallpox Eradication. And right up here is, on the top, first person is the distinguished Australian Frank Fenner, who's no longer with us. And I just wanted to say that it's been extraordinary being here today, particularly meeting with members of the Melbourne community, because Australia punches way above its weight in the vaccine community. The number of great vaccinologists, leaders, many of the diseases we're going to talk about, people learned about the diseases or helped create the vaccines that we're moving forward. So it's really an extraordinary history. So we normally talk about smallpox. When I put this up, even at Gavi, people said, Rinderpest, what's that? Well, actually, that's the second organism that has been eradicated. This was a terrible disease of animals. Guinea worm is on its way. That's a parasite. Polio is the next great challenge. I put a question mark because obviously we're not there yet. We'll come back to that. And then measles is probably right after. What we know are both of these diseases people thought were not possible, but we've seen now in real life polio has been eliminated from large parts of the earth, initially in the Americas, and so has measles. So we know these things are possible. The question is, do we have the will? And an example of this is what's happened in polio eradication. You can see there on the left, 1988, when the Global Polio Eradication Initiative was started. There were 125 countries that were endemic for wild polio, 350,000 children paralyzed. This year, there's only 3 countries left. And what's extraordinary is India, which had the largest number of cases 2 years ago, has now been free of polio for 1 full year. This shows, with political will, with determination, what can happen. Now, vaccines make a huge difference on the ground, and here's an example. And by the way, the epidemiologists in the audience know that once you start measuring things, they usually go up, so that's why we saw a rise when we started measuring it. But here's what happens when you take a vaccine and introduce it. And Haemophilus influenza type B is extraordinary because as this vaccine began to get rolled out, what we saw was a herd effect, that other people in the community, after a certain point, stopped getting the disease. The disease started disappearing, and this is the power of vaccines. It goes beyond the individual, it goes to the community. But in addition to the diseases, and this is a complicated slide, and I'm sorry, there are dramatic effects from vaccines. What we know is if children are healthy, they're able to attend school, they're able to learn well. If they have less illness, their families don't have to spend the rare amount of money they have to try to make them healthy, to pay for health care out of their pockets. This often tips families into poverty. The children live longer. The families have a longer life expectancy. This increases labor productivity. And an important thing that people don't talk enough about is it's a prerequisite, it's an absolute necessity that you have to have healthy families and you have to have children surviving before parents will have smaller families. With smaller families, of course, there's more money to invest in the children, and that also means, obviously, less stress on the environment. So this is very important. We don't have a lot of data on this, but we tend to think of vaccines as their role on disease. But in fact, what's more important is what effect is it having on overall levels of education, the rate of return for these children in society. And one calculation that was done by a set of economists showed a rate of return of 12 to 18%. And just as in a comparison, education, which we consider the most important intervention, has, as you can see, 19, 13, and 11 for primary, secondary, and higher. So you can see how powerful the rate of return as vaccines are. And one interesting and tantalizing study showed fully immunized child at 11 years had increases, statistically significant increases in IQ, language, and math testing versus those not immunized. So we need to do a lot more of studies to understand it. It's intuitively obvious, but very powerful. So let me move to why Gavi. So Gavi's mission is to save children's lives and to protect people's health by increasing access to immunization in poor countries. Gavi was started after a series of other initiatives: the Task Force for Child Survival, Universal Childhood Immunization with Jim Grant, the Children's Vaccine Initiative. But Gavi was a very bold public-private partnership to try to bring all the partners together on immunization. 4 major goals: to accelerate the uptake and use of unused and new vaccines, to contribute to the strengthening of the capacity of integrated health systems to deliver immunizations, but obviously to do more, to increase the predictability of global financing and improve the sustainability of national financing for immunization, and finally to shape vaccine markets. And I'll touch briefly on all of these. So what has Gavi achieved? So we've immunized more than 300 million children. We've contributed to preventing more than 5.5 million future deaths. We've accelerated vaccine introductions in over 7 countries, strengthened the health systems, and helped shape the vaccine markets. And here you can see the diseases that are affected. Early on, hepatitis B was the most important one. Hepatitis B, a vaccine very important, that again, the work for getting this going was done here in Australia. We'll see later on that we're going to see different effects of this going on in the future. Now, one of the amazing things is what happens when you make an effort to try to get these vaccines to where they need it. So here's routine use of hepatitis B, year 2000. You can see about 60% in high-income countries. And 10 years later, you can see a better uptake of vaccine, getting close to 80%. The developing world, of course, in 2000, almost nothing, very small number. But look at what's happened since then with this effort. It's actually exceeded that in the developed world. And one of the big reasons this has happened is in China, which had a terrible, terrible epidemic of liver cancer, and now very high coverage of hepatitis B vaccine, and therefore they're going to, in the future, have much lower levels of cancer. Now, immunization is something very important for poor countries because it often is the only contact people have with the health services. This is a clinic, and you can see it's meeting under a tree. It's an opportunity to reach out to people. You saw, for example, in India, they had to reach every child with polio vaccine to be able to do that. And so one of the issues is how we use this as a way to bring health systems to the population. It's important because although I'm focused on immunization, I don't want my immunized child to die of malaria or die of HIV or anything else. And so how we integrate those systems without distracting us is one of the challenges. But Gavi spends a lot of effort on trying to improve health systems, particularly around immunization. Let's talk a little bit about equity. HPV vaccine. Ian Fraser, an Australian, invented this, work done at CSL. Here is the distribution of HPV vaccine in last July. You can see the distribution here. If we look at Gavi-eligible countries, you can see that's the striped countries. These are the 73 countries with a gross national income under $1,500. You can see there's almost no overlay between where the vaccine's going and where we're working. But look at the map of cervical cancer mortality. And you can see a very close overlay of the map of mortality with the Gavi eligible. So in other words, this vaccine is being used in the places that have, in a sense, the least need for it. I don't want to say no need because obviously everywhere in the world needs it. And Australia was the first country to roll it out, and that's fabulous. And again, here's the overlap of the Gavi countries compared to the mortality. So this is something about equity. Here's an example of what's happening over time. You can see in high-income countries, the expected incidence of this disease is going to be relatively flat, whereas in low-income countries, we're seeing an increase. So this is going to be more of a problem, not less, over time. And what's important about this is not only do you see this difference in high-income countries, here's the incidence and here's the mortality, but what you can see in comparison to low and middle-income countries, they have a higher incidence of disease. But of course, once you get disease, you also have a higher mortality. And so they have a double whammy, higher disease burden and less ability to deal with if they get it, which is why it's so critical to get these vaccines to them. So let's talk a little bit about how we sustain this over time. So Gavi asked every country to contribute, if they're very poor, just a little bit of money. And the idea there is to get it into their ministries of finance, not ministries of health, ministries of finance. Line item for vaccines, initially a small payment. As countries get wealthier, an increasing payment, with the idea is that when they get above $1,500, they will graduate from Gavi. Interestingly, if you look at the cost of all the vaccines put together for very low-income countries, you can see that this would be a pretty big burden on their health budget. But by the time countries graduate, it's less than 1% of their overall health budget. Now, what that means, it is theoretically something any country can afford. Most countries who are graduating will do this, but there are some countries who may not, and those are countries who don't have the political will, who don't spend the money that they have on the social sectors, on their population's health. And those are the countries, obviously, we worry about, and we have to work to try to get them to focus more on the needs of their population. Now, we also are trying to change pricing of vaccines, and it's important that it isn't just price, it's supply security, it's a healthy vaccine market. But here's some examples of the dramatic effects that we've had. If we look over here at the pneumococcal vaccine, Gavi's price is a 97% price reduction from the price that's available in the public sector. You can see on rotavirus, on other vaccines as well. So we've been able to make a dramatic difference. We've also worked very closely with the manufacturers of vaccines to assure that graduating countries can keep these prices, and that's very important. Now, one of the ways we do this is not just to work with large multinationals, but also to work with vaccine manufacturers in the developing world. When Gavi first started, most of the supply was from the developed world manufacturers. Today, the majority of the suppliers are in the developing world. And with competition comes a reduction in price. These little X's, though, are a reminder of a danger here, because as you drive price down and you work with manufacturers that have less margin, you begin to see problems, and these are vaccine manufacturers that have lost their pre-qualification. That is a WHO badge that says the quality is good enough. And so, again, we have to be careful because we want to keep a large number of suppliers, but they must be safe vaccines because we must keep public trust on the quality of vaccination. So let's say where we're going in the future. So I've told you all the great things that are going on with vaccines. But today, 19 million children are still missing out from vaccine. One child dies of a vaccine-preventable disease every 20 seconds. So we need to do more. We need to get these vaccines out more. And if you look at the distribution of countries, you can see on the top, India. How ironic is that? India produces 2/3 of the world's vaccines that are used in the developing world, but they have the largest number of unimmunized children in the world. I've already told you that India was able to eliminate polio in this last year. It meant they got out to everyone. So the challenge there is its political will and getting them to engage on it. Happily, they're so excited by what they did with polio that they're really moving now, and we're seeing India really move along on a range of new vaccines, and that's fabulous. Other countries also have problems. A lot of these are countries you can recognize have political problems, instability, but it doesn't mean we don't work there. And what we're trying to do is make sure that all children have access to these vaccines. Now, what are the largest killers of children today? Well, it turns out the two largest killers are pneumonia and diarrhea. This is about 36% of all of the child deaths. And lo and behold, science has brought us vaccines for the largest cause of pneumonia in children and the largest cause of diarrhea in children. And I'll just comment that the founder of the organism that caused the most common diarrhea, rotavirus, Ruth Bishop, is here in the audience today. Again, something to be proud of, the science that is being done here in Australia. So I told you these vaccines are out there, but look at what's happening. We've done pretty well in the general vaccines. We see 82% immunized. It's the highest number ever in the world. But if we move down to these new vaccines, they're barely out. So this is really the challenge that Gavi's got in front of us right now. We were very lucky. In June, we had a replenishment conference, and we had political leadership that was unlike what had been seen in the immunization field before. We have Jan Stoltenberg of Norway, David Cameron of the UK, by the way, a political leader who was struggling with huge financial problems and made this the occasion for him to stand up as a conservative government and say how important it was to invest in children in the developing world. Ellen Sirleaf-Johnson from Liberia, Bill Gates, and Andrew Mitchell, who's the UK Secretary of State. Kevin Rudd was there from Australia and led to an extraordinary increase in support for Gavi. Australia went from having $6 million Australian dollars a year to a $200 million 3-year commitment and has lifted them up to the 6th largest supporter of Gavi. So we were very lucky because of the challenge, because of people knowing this, to raise at this particular event $4.3 billion, which gives us the resources to roll these vaccines out. This is not going to be easy, though. If you look at pneumococcal, this is what's been done so far, and you can see it's beginning to roll out. This is what's approved now to move forward, and this is what is forecast. So you can see a huge task for us to do in the next few years. Rotavirus vaccine, what's already out there, you can see just beginning in Africa, only one country. Here's what's approved, and here's what's forecast. So we have a huge task in front of us. Now, one of the challenges that many in this audience will understand is that to do this type of work, we have to know what's going on in the ground. And data is a huge problem. This is an example of one country, Ethiopia. This is what the official estimates look like, 86%. This is what surveys have shown, 36%. This is obviously large enough to not be a little bit of a rounding error or a sampling error. So we don't know what the true value is here. This is true in many countries. Having better surveillance system and understanding it is important to not only evaluate what we're doing, but to understand how many vaccines need to go out there. So this is an area that needs a lot of improvement. We also have a problem you have here in Australia, they have in the United States, and is beginning to be a problem in other parts of the world. And these are vaccine denialists, people who don't believe in vaccines. And of course, it's easy in places where we don't have a lot of disease to say, well, gee, I don't want my children to have that. I'm, worried about side effects, because they don't remember that. But we have to remember that these viruses move around the world. And an example of this is what's happened with measles, which is a disease that, again, we didn't see a lot of. And you can see there's a lot of countries in the developing world with large number of cases. But look at this. Here's France with, as of September, and the outbreak went up, more than 20,000 cases of measles. Now, of course, if you're in France, you're less likely to die than if you're in somewhere like Bangladesh, but it doesn't matter because people do die, and of course, these diseases will continue to spread. So the disease burden in the world is all of our problem. So where are we going? We're going to be looking at new vaccines. HPV I've already mentioned, huge problem, kills 270,000 women a year, most in the developing world. Rubella, which is again a vaccine that you take for granted here, is not being used in these parts of the world. 90,000 congenital rubella syndrome. That's a syndrome for unborn babies that cause them to have terrible birth defects or abortions. We're also looking at a range of new vaccines. Japanese encephalitis is a vaccine important in this region with high fatality rate. Typhoid in urban areas. Malaria, there's now a new vaccine that is in phase 3 trials. The initial phase 3 trial looked promising. We're waiting to see what it's going to look like in young children. But if this happens, this will be a very important vaccine for the developing world. As we move towards the end game of polio, inactivated polio vaccine, which will reduce any vaccine-induced polio, is an important priority. Dengue is coming along, again important in this area, new TB vaccines, and of course, HIV is probably the toughest organism we've ever worked with, but the science is exquisite, and we are seeing breakthroughs every day on that. And of course, that's the one way we'll be able to really get a handle on the AIDS epidemic. So one of the challenges is you'd think that this network, this collection of immunization people would all work together as one happy family, but they haven't. There's been a separate effort on polio eradication and a separate effort on measles and new vaccines and traditional vaccines. And one of the roles that I think is critical is to bring this all together, to work together, to share, to have shared synergies. And this is something that we're working on closely at Gavi. So with that, I thank you very much for listening. I hope you've gotten a good sense of what it is that we're trying to do. One of the most interesting things about Gavi is we don't have staff in the developing world. We operate as a public-private partnership, working with partners wherever they are to help us implement there. And that makes us very efficient, but it also means that we're constantly looking for new people to help us on this quest. And I hope I can count all of you in the future on helping us with this. So thank you very much.
Yes, I don't think there's going to be any problem with that. Thank you very much, Seth Berkley. Well, let's get on with our forum. This is obviously a chance where we get to, get you involved. So don't forget, there'll be roving microphones going around. There's also Twitter. You can put your questions in on Twitter. The hashtag is AusInWorld, AUS in World. But let's welcome up Sir Gus Nossal, first of all. Sir Gus, thank you so much for coming. Tim Costello, the CEO of World Vision. Thank you also, Tim, for being here. And Dr. Kate Taylor from the Nossal Institute for Global Health at the University of Melbourne, which is, of course, where we are. Our panel, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Let's begin. Sir Gus, I'm going to call you Gus for this evening. I hope you're okay with that. I think one of the things that probably struck us here was the work that's being done in Australia that's contributing to this, especially in this next phase of the vaccines that are being rolled out. The rotavirus, for example. Just perhaps talk us through some of the work that has been done here.
Well, thanks very much, and welcome to Australia, Seth, and my distinguished fellow panellists, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Fantastic to be here. Now, to answer your question, Ben, there is indeed a very proud history of vaccine-related research in Australia. We've mentioned Ruth Bishop, Julie Bynes, the well-advanced rotavirus vaccine candidate, which will be able to be given as a birth dose and will be much cheaper than the present vaccines. Hope it comes off. Ian Fraser, the relationship with CSL, the wonderful human papillomavirus vaccine. We'd just forgotten, my old boss, Mac Burnett, who actually worked out the way of growing the influenza virus in fertile hen's eggs and mass-producing the influenza vaccine. But the future is bright. And I'm going to only mention two of many research initiatives that are going on. We are contributing, I think, very well to what you might call the stage 2 or second generation malaria vaccine, because the RTSS, though wonderful and though nothing but admiration for it, is only 50% effective, 56% in the first phase 3 trials
In older children.
done in toddlers. We don't know yet what it'll do in infants. We'll know soon, thank goodness, after a 25-year research effort, a massive research effort. But I think that it is almost certain that the definitive malaria vaccine will be not just against that form of the parasite which the mosquito injects, the so-called sporozoite, but indeed against all the stages of that parasite's complex life cycle. Australia's a big contributor here. Second one I want to mention picks up on your pneumococcus, because there's another coccus, not quite as nasty as the pneumococcus, and it's called GAS, the Group A Streptococcus. Now, you probably don't worry much about Group A strep, because to you it might mean a sore throat or it might mean otitis media. But if you lived in a remote Australian Indigenous community, I'm shocked to have to tell you that we have the highest point incidence in the world of rheumatic fever and rheumatic heart disease resulting from a complication of the infection with Group A Streptococcus. And furthermore, as well as that, we have a very high incidence of kidney disease, the so-called post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis, very well known, practically gone from the industrialised world, still there in our own Indigenous community. And my student and dear friend Michael Good is hooked up with Dave Jackson here in Melbourne, and they're working hard on a Group A strep vaccine. Let's hope it comes off. Plenty more to come. Last word. There's a very important point that Seth mentioned but did not elaborate on, and that's the question of co-payment. Symbolically important, practically important. And I'll tell you one great thing that we did as one of the very, very first Garvey initiatives. The king of hepatitis B was a chap called Mark Kane. We brought him over from WHO, where I'd worked with him for a decade or more, into the Garvey Alliance. And he was therefore keen on hepatitis B. And at one stage we visited India together. And we went to see the chief minister of Andhra Pradesh state, which is the state where Hyderabad is and all those wonderful high-tech factories. And here's the deal that Mark Kane proposed. He said, I will immunise your birth cohort with hepatitis B and pay for it totally. If next year you pick up 20% of the costs, and the next year 40% of the cost, the next year 60% of the cost, till finally, after 5 years, you're paying for all of it. Naidu shook his hand, and to a large extent that's what happened. How exactly it worked out, I don't know. But that's sustainability, and it's a central plank of your very wise platform. Thank you.
Thank you, Gus. Which very, very neatly leads into what we'll hear from Tim Costello about. I mean, it's all right to pay 20% in the following year, but it has to start somewhere. And in fact, it was interesting, Seth, you reminded me, which I'd completely forgotten about, of David Cameron's remarkable contribution which he made. I just remember how big news that was at the time. Where I was in the world at the time, Kevin Rudd's contribution didn't get so much coverage. I don't know how much it got here, but from 6 million to 250 is quite considerable. So, $250 million from us, taxpayers via AusAid. Tim Costello, what do you think?
Terrific. And I think most of us here in this room know the one thing the major parties agree on, still at the moment, is that aid should be bipartisan, so that we have an increasing aid budget under Kevin Rudd's leadership that started when he was opposition leader. We have committed to getting to 0.5% of GNI by 2015. Still only 50 cents in every $100, and when you ask Australians how much we give in aid, people go, 10%, 15%. Well, actually, if you hand out $100 worth of 50-cent coins and say, how many of those coins do we actually give? And say it's not even one coin at the moment. At the moment it's about 35 cents, but we're going to get to 50. People are shocked. They think we're generous. So I think it was incredibly good that Kevin Rudd made that commitment and was there with David Cameron. I think it's incredibly important that the private-public partnership be explored too. I think we've had a little bit of press about some Australian billionaires and how much are they giving and what's this level of give back and generosity in our nation at the moment. It's fascinating to me, and Seth may want to comment on this, that we don't have here in Australia the level of private giving represented by the Gates and the Buffetts and the Ted Turners, $1 billion to the UN fund, all paying the fees for America, really, for that. We haven't had an initiative where a Gates has gone to the mega rich in America and saying, come on, 50%, step up. You can easily live on your other 50%. There may be something in our relative traditions. I think Americans have long had the Andrew Carnegie philosophy. The great industrialist, philanthropist, said, the man who dies rich dies disgraced. Australian rich don't seem to have caught on with that idea. I personally think that our mega-rich have been let off the hook here in Australia compared to American and British. It's very interesting. When I launched a function in Perth at the invitation of the Governor of Western Australia, where the money's being made, that I did a bit of research and found the lowest level of charitable giving per head comes from Western Australia, where all the money is. Quite curious.
Did you raise that?
I certainly did, and I had the car engine running and headed out of town very quickly after that. But I certainly think that it's not only important that we keep this bipartisanship support of 0.5, and can I invite you to write to Bob Carr and say why you support that? I'm a little bit fearful that there might be slippage with the need for a budget surplus. But I equally think the private sector stepping up to the plate here is really fundamentally important. I know the private sector say, but we create the jobs and we pay some tax. What's, of course, accounted for is that the human resources they depend on have been funded in education and health and of course, infrastructure by the taxpayer. That's what makes business profitable also, and that's fundamentally important to remind the private sector they're just not off the hook because they paid some tax.
Well, nor do you have to go to the United States for examples either, especially in this city in Melbourne with the Meyer family, just to name one. It's there. But this is perhaps a good time to bring in Dr. Kate Taylor on this one, because we are talking about that private money. And what we are talking about here is a system where you have these public and private partnerships, and for those taxpayer dollars, for example, from Australia going into the system and combining those with the private dollars. Why is this system working? Because if we had a look at those figures, we had a look at those graphs, we all saw the change that is taking place. Why, all of a sudden, under this system, are the vaccines starting to go out?
Well, it's a very good question, thank you. And I think we live in an era of extraordinary change. Globalisation rewrote all sorts of rules. And whereas after World War II, it was a UN made by governments, by member states, all of a sudden we have people like Bill Gates who basically have a worth bigger than some countries. And so they have their own power that they bring, and they have their own expertise as well. Now, obviously, Bill Gates, first and foremost, has been a businessman. Won't go into all of his business practices, but he brings a mindset that is quite different from the traditional development mindset. And so what happened is you get a change from being essentially a government-run world to being a multi-stakeholder world and a multipolar world. And so it's more complicated, but also the problems are more complicated. We look at, in climate change, we look at global migration, you look at global finances. The interlinkages and interdependence is much greater. So we need to be smarter in how we come up with solutions. And I think really it was part of a movement recognising that governments no longer have all the answers. Also, governments were recognising that problems were getting more and more expensive. AIDS was a very scary problem because it was going to be a very expensive problem if you actually tried to tackle it. And so there was also a bit of looking around going, where can we get some more resources? Oh, I know, rich companies, that'll be quite helpful. But that isn't quite how it worked out, because in fact what companies said, somewhat understandably, is that, essentially, we pay taxes. We're not going to give away all this money. That's not what we're responsible for doing for our shareholders. But let's figure out how we can do things smarter. And so what happened was there was a new discussion about what are the needs of both sides? What does the public sector need? What does the private sector need? And how do you bring it together? And so before Gavi, there was this immense pressure on, for example, vaccine prices, because clearly everyone was looking at the problem, and the problem was that there was at least 20 years between when a vaccine came out in the rich countries and when it got to the most needy countries, the poor countries. And so that 20-year problem articulated had a whole lot of factors in it. Firstly, did you have the right vaccines? Were you developing the right vaccines? Were you making enough? Because there are 130 million children in the world, but only about 6 or 7 in rich countries. So the step up for manufacturing capacity is enormous. And then do you have the systems to get there? But then comes the big question, okay, if you've got the pipes to get vaccines out, can you afford it? And so people were really looking at the prices of vaccines, which were very high and absolutely unaffordable. And so people started trying to press those prices further and further down. And what happened was that the manufacturers said, we can't make money like this, and they left. And so you started having pressure on supply because there weren't people left to make them. And also there was no research. So what happened then was Bill Gates and Gavi and all sorts of people stepped in to say, okay, let's create a more sustainable solution. Let's invest in public-private partnerships to develop vaccines. Let's invest in public-private partnerships to deliver vaccines with Gavi. And let's create a market that's a longer-term sustainable solution that recognises all of these needs, that brings together the resources and the expertise of all of these different players. And I haven't talked about NGOs and academia and others, but obviously they're all important. But let's try and get combined forces to deal with a really complex and important problem.
Well,
and that was
there's a number of points in there that I would personally like to tease out, but we're actually going to throw it open to the audience at this point. So if you have a question...
Should we take one from the Twitter sphere?
Yes,
First?
sure.
Estelle Petrie asks, Seth mentioned political will is sometimes an obstacle to vaccination in the developing world. How can we overcome this?
We'd all like to have enlightened leaders whose primary interest is the health, well-being, education, etc. of their populations. We don't have that in many parts of the world. And so I think the challenge in places where there is public opinion and that matters, try to get the public to care about it. In places where there isn't, try to get the global community to care about it. And so one of the issues that's really interesting is with the type of political support we're getting, as country after country gets engaged, it becomes embarrassing for those countries that aren't engaged. And the discussions that go on in international bodies matter a lot. They can't force a country to do that, but what it does is it sets norms. Lastly, and I mentioned this, it's critical to not just pay attention to the ministries of health. Ministries of health are often the lowest minister on the totem pole. It's seen as
Women.
Well, maybe Ministry of Women, Ministry of Health. I mean, there's many above that, Ministry of Sport, and all the others. It is critical, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Planning in countries. Those are the ones we have to get engaged and get that conversation going. And having places like the World Bank, to do that are critical. So, for example, we will go to the World Bank meetings in October that are going to be held in Japan and hold meetings with ministers of finance, and hopefully in that circumstance it will not only be developing countries' ministers of finance, but it'll be ministers of finances of places like Australia that will say, we spend our money on vaccines, and with these high level of coverage, we're preventing a lot of disease.
Okay, do we have a question from the audience? Yes, just here, thing.
Hi, I don't...
Just hold it close.
Just hold it close. Okay. I'm really glad you guys brought up cancer, actually. I think it's really important. I've had a discussion. I went to the Girls 20 Summit, actually, as the Australian delegate last year, and I worked in the health group. And a lot of delegates from the developing world were saying how important it is to address cancer. So that's just a comment. But my question is, would you agree, anyone, that to make this an important issue in the world, we have to make it an economic issue, because that is what leaders pay attention to?
I might go to Tim on that one.
There's no question that the market rules and economics is the lever that you need to pull. I wouldn't discount the fact that human sympathy and empathy, because cancer, the C word, strikes the fear into any one of us when a loved one has cancer, is also equally very, very powerful. But in terms of addressing it, doing an economic analysis is always a base foundation to start.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that? And today, we know that 19% of cancers are caused by infectious agents. We believe that it's a much, much larger percentage. We just haven't identified the agents. In fact, many of the so-called non-communicable diseases, it's actually a misnomer, actually have infectious causes, probably juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, maybe juvenile diabetes, many of these diseases. So over time, hopefully, we'll be able to get vaccines against those diseases. The other point is that prevention is always more cost-effective than treatment. On the other hand, as Tim has mentioned, when people get sick, they'll pay anything to get well, and so societies tend to prioritize treatment rather than prevention. And so this is part of the education issue that we have to work on.
Gus, do you have anything to add on any work that's being done in that area?
No, I profoundly agree with the last two sets of remarks. In fact, my eye kept going to Terry Nolan, because he has the awesome responsibility of advising the Australian government on what vaccines to introduce for free to this country. And rightly or wrongly, fortunately or unfortunately, he is enjoined to make cost-benefit probably the biggest single determinant thereof. But I think he'd be a good person to comment at this time if you've got time, Ben.
Well, we actually do, but we'll, just while we line that up, let's see if...
Thanks very much, Gus.
Things not working.
The reality in the developed world is that the opportunity cost for any health intervention, including vaccines, is something that is used as a decision point by governments. Unfortunately, there is a rational base for it in Australia, and that cost-effectiveness argument is something which has worked very well in Australia, because governments have invested very substantially in publicly funded vaccines in Australia. The opportunity for that logic, if you like, to be extended elsewhere in the world remains to be fully realised. And the political decision-making that sits on top of that framework in Australia, despite Gus's generosity in his comment, I don't actually make that recommendation, or my committee doesn't. It's made through the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee mechanism in Australia. And the government does not have to fund publicly or recommended vaccines from that process. It cannot fund vaccines that are not recommended by that process. And at the moment, a number of recommendations have been made by that fairly rigorous process, and the government, because of its own difficulties with balancing a budget, has decided still not to fund some things. One example, is Zostavax, which is a vaccine for adults to prevent shingles caused by the chickenpox virus. So the whole notion, though, of understanding what the community benefit from vaccines is that underpins this framework is a good thing. And it's a good part of public policy and how governments can be, if you like, moved to a position of making those investments when the argument can be made about the benefit for the community. And in the developing world, many of the problems people talked before about the political will, is that decisions are made, despite the pressing evidence for health benefit, decisions are made about investment of public funds in the military or in other forms of politically attractive investment which make no sense for the community at all.
Let's go to some more questions from the floor, unless we have another... What is the right word? Tweet? Up the back.
there. Another question from the Twitter sphere. As we successfully immunise and increase life expectancy, the online question was, what impact does that have on global overpopulation?
That's a good question. Let's go to Seth on that one.
I mean, it's a great question, and it's a really interesting question because, in fact, it's counterintuitive. Families have large numbers of children, large family sizes, because that is, in essence, their insurance. You know, it's their Social Security growing up. And if you know that you're going to have many of your children die, you have a large family size. Once we know that your children are going to survive and are going to be healthy across the entire world, what we've seen is a shrinkage of family size. And in fact, we've seen a rapid shrinkage in family size recently from those effects. Now, of course, from the previous years, we're still seeing a growth of population, but it is this health effect that has made the biggest difference. Obviously, along with that, we have to have availability of modern contraceptives and other tools, but it's the will that is critical.
Can I jump in there? Because I think this is one of the most gross misunderstandings we have. People all seem to say to us in World Vision, just tell them to stop having children, then they won't be poor. If you think of our great-grandparents who had big families because there wasn't social security and health benefits and all the things we have, they had big families. As soon as they were being lifted out of poverty, they moved to zero population growth. So it's the other way around. If we actually deal with poverty, we'll deal with population growth. We need to reverse the order rather than the way we think.
Kate.
Well, I'd just add that there's a real challenge because 100 million people a year are driven back into poverty because of illness. And this is because they're paying out of pocket and there aren't healthcare systems and social security nets. So anything you can do to prevent illness, whether it's through immunisation or through tobacco reduction, so on and so forth, these are really important interventions because they are pro-development and they're particularly pro-poor. In other words, they really address inequities because it is the poor people who are most vulnerable to the bankruptcy that comes with getting sick.
I'm ashamed to admit that is the first time I've heard that argument so cogently put, or at least in a way that's resonated with me. Perhaps the part of the world that I've been in, it's been completely different. People have large families because a large family in those parts of the world ends up being your own private army. So whether the kids are immunised or not doesn't really make a difference. It's a completely different mindset. But why is it that is not more widely broadcast? It's a very, very good answer to the biggest and probably most common public question of all. Thoughts?
Gus?
Look, I'm minded to think of one of the more embarrassing moments in my life. When I had the great good fortune of taking over the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute, I was presented with a visitor's book that my predecessor, Sir Macfarlane Burnet, had started some 30 years previously. And the first name in the book, on the facing page occupying the book, was Philip. Just the signature, Philip, and the date. That, of course, was the Duke of Edinburgh. All those years later, the Duke of Edinburgh came to visit again. I'd actually had a special new visitor's book prepared, bound in the same leather. It cost me about $300. You know, it was an extraordinary thing. And I had the facing page clean. He was going to be the first entry. And amongst the things that I showed him our cancer research, of course, amongst the things I showed him was our work on a malaria vaccine. And Graham was there, he'll remember the occasion very well. And then pompously at the end of the thing, there was the usual morning tea. He said, well, Nossel or Gus or whatever he called me, you realise you're destroying the world. And you realise that all of these kids that you're saving from malaria are going to only add to the overpopulation situation. And, you know, what do you say when royalty tells you something that is absolute bullshit?
This is speaking as a knight of the realm, of course.
Yes. And so, very delicately, but not as eloquently, I tried to put the points that Seth and the others have made so well. But it is absolutely clear. It was well known in Burnet's time. They had examples of countries that were developing where just as Kate said, there is a brief democratic bubble, as you, for example, control malaria, a brief demographic bubble, as you say, and then it self-corrects, and indeed it overcorrects. So the short answer is, if you want to control population, don't do it by high death rates. High death rates is not a smart way to control population size. You do it by lowering birth rates, which happens naturally as women want to space their families as they gain the increasing affluence and don't need to over-insure because of all of the infant deaths.
So what you're in fact doing is creating a world with people who won't get a pension and no grandchildren to support them.
Well, it's a very good one, Ben, but I'm a bit more optimistic than that. I think it's amazing the number of countries we have lifted out of poverty over these last 20 or 30 years. Tell them again your concept of the graduating countries, because you didn't make that quite clear.
Well, the original idea was you take the poorest countries and you say to them 20 cents a dose for vaccine, which is something they can afford. As they move up into lower middle income countries, then increase, 15% a year the amount they're paying, and then as they get close to graduation, the same kind of 20, 40, 60, 80. So when they graduate, then they're paying the full cost of the vaccine. And of course, the interesting thing is that by the time they're above $1,500, it's less than 1% of their national health budgets, and so any country can afford it if there's the political will.
But he did also tell us that each year countries graduate. They graduate out of the most impoverished into the next category, and that, I'm sure, will continue.
Indeed. Let's go to some more questions. Yes, we have one up here.
My question is a little bit tangential, but I hope that you will bear with me. It has a domestic focus, but I feel like it is... would have international reach and results. I'm really talking about vaccination, immunisation deniers, the people in Australia and in other parts of the world who believe that immunising kids, vaccinating infants and other children... Did I just come on? Did everyone hear the rest of what I was saying?
We heard.
Okay. In my life, I've encountered a lot of people who've been anti-immunisation. I think it's a dangerous ignorance, but I personally don't feel like I have the knowledge or resources to fight against it because I'm not studying medicine, I'm not studying nursing, and I don't want to fight ignorance with ignorance. So I'm wondering, as people on the panel who are very clearly influential, public opinion swayers, I'm wondering whether we could get some responses on how we as the general public could go about changing public opinion on this issue where necessary.
Let's go to Kate on that one.
Well, I think the first thing is just understanding. It is a very natural response to want to protect your child and not to hurt it. And even just giving an injection, babies cry, and that makes mothers cry. I mean, it's hard. So nobody's doing it because they're trying to hurt anyone. What was very interesting in the role that I had before was we looked across the world and had a look why did different countries have different patterns of vaccine denial. And the key thing that jumped out was there are a lot of different reasons, but political is often one of them. And we saw countries where immunisation programs absolutely stopped because one political party wanted to score points on another and used a health institute as a way of doing it, because there is this underlying fear that they could tap into, and the media likes that kind of story. There are real pockets of people that have deep beliefs, that have different belief systems around health. We had a debate last week in the press I saw about homeopathy, for example, in Australia. There's not a scientific support for it. People believe in it deeply. We do recognise the placebo effect is important, so on and so forth. But should we pay for it is a real question. So when people are citing really bad science, it's helpful if you do know the science. And so it's really helpful when doctors understand the science, which doesn't always happen. And I think what you have to do is actually start building bridges. You can't just say, no, you're wrong and you're loony, because it's not engagement. It is really important that more people get informed, though, because as Seth was talking and as Gus was talking, there is this herd immunity. And so children who are too young yet to have been vaccinated are at risk because of everyone else. And so trying to build the understanding more widely is actually a very important thing. I've got to say, doctors have done a really bad job at this because they think if we just tell more technical facts, people will get it. And I'll just keep hammering you with facts and that'll be convincing. But of course, it's a deeply emotional issue. So we also need to get back to the story of how terrible whooping cough is, for example. You know, when I was a med student at the Royal Children's, we watched these kids with whooping cough, shaking and shaking and shaking. And we should never see that in Australia. You know, so how do you tell that story?
Seth, you're the one who has to tell it. Would this be the first or second biggest criticism that you get? Overpopulation or this one?
If you look at the demographics who are resisting immunization in the developed world, it tends to be high income, high education. Often we call them in the United States the Whole Foods crowd, you know, the organic mothers. And it turns out it's because they read a lot and they understand it. One last point that's changed dramatically is in the old days, if somebody published something that was wrong, it could be retracted. Today on the internet, you can't retract it. So there's a very famous case of Andrew Wakefield, a scientist who falsified information about the linkage between measles, mumps and rubella vaccine and autism. That has been discredited. It's been withdrawn. You go on the internet today.
It's still there.
It is still there, and the rest of the world sees it now. So it's very hard to go backwards. So we do need a new dialogue. We have to work on this because trust of vaccines is absolutely critical for us to have this bargain, to be able to roll it out and get the herd immunity that's important.